He had learned to measure a day by the way the light slid across the mesa, how the late summer sun burned copper into everything it touched and then folded itself into shade. The cabin sat low against the ridge, like a promise half kept. 3 walls solid, the 4th only begun, a lean-to for winter that never quite came. Eli Cross swung the hammer with the economy of a man who'd learned that a crooked nail could speak of fault lines deeper than wood, of mistakes, of people left behind. Dust rose in slow ghosts around his boots. A horse kicked softly in its stall. Somewhere below, the stream wound its dry silver through the wash. He had built the place with hands that remembered other hands. A camp, a life of tracking, the kind that left blood in rope-fibered seams and a taste of iron at the base of the tongue. The work kept him narrow, one task after another, nothing wasted on sentiment. Stillness had been his refuge and his armor. He liked the rhythm, board, hammer, nail, evening ponding light sleep. He liked the distance from towns where memory got tangled with faces and names he'd rather not speak. So when he saw the figure on the ridge, his first thought was that the sunlight played tricks, something dark against sand and sky. He set the hammer down, wiped his palms on his jeans, and squinted. The woman stood at the crest, hair braided, the wind feathering dust into her skirts. She was small against the horizon, but the shape of her made his mouth go dry. He had not expected anything that could stop his breath. She saw him too. For a moment the world narrowed to the space between them, a pair of hands slack at her hips, a long line of shadow thrown across her face by the sun. She lifted one hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture that said, "Stay." Then she descended the slope, boots counting out tenacious steps on the hard soil. When she reached the wash below the cabin, Eli noticed the details the way a tracker notices hoofprints, wrists raw where cords had once bound, a faint white pallor under the eyes as if too many nights ended awake, a thin scar that cut a pale line along her jaw. She did not look like a woman who had spent her life waiting to be rescued. She bore her marks like an argument. "Do you remember me?" she asked, voice low and steady, and the words cut through the dry air. His chest tightened because the voice belonged to a child he had pulled from burning pines years before. A child who had screamed and smelled of smoke and fell asleep in his coat with soot in her hair. The child had been light enough to lift without thinking. He had carried her through a night that felt like a throat closing, through hands that wanted to take her away for reasons he wouldn't name. After that, he'd told himself the rescue was one clean thing he could put on the ledger and close. The woman in front of him was not the child he remembered. Where once there had been fear, now there was a deliberate calm so complete it surprised him. Her eyes, dark and steady, fixed on his with the same unblinkable certainty he had seen in 6 faces when he'd led them out of danger. The name she used was a whisper he knew before it left her lips. "Atsai," she said, and it was the same name he'd written in a margin once, in a notebook he had thrown away when the guilt became too loud. "Do you remember me, Cowboy?" He had not expected to be called that. The nickname belonged to other lives, barroom laughter and a badge that didn't fit his pockets anymore. He had no ready answer. Memory was an animal that came in fits. He had trained himself not to be caught by nostalgia. But the image that rose then was blistered and plain as wood grain. A small girl wrapped in his coat, the old smoke on her hair, the hardness around his own heart that eased for the smallest of reasons. He remembered. He remembered failing to save others. He remembered lifting someone without thinking of cost. She tipped her chin, the motion simple as a stone dropped in a stream. "You saved me once," she said. "I'm back." He looked at her hands. The skin where a rope had cut was pale and puckered, like the underside of a leaf. There were places on her arms where the sun had already worked its map, and a bruise that had not yet faded. Her clothes were patched in many places, held together by thread that did not match. For a dizzy second he saw the child again, No guards, no teeth bared, only a small head against his chest. And then the woman before him hardened like clay set in the oven. "Why?" he said. The question was small, practical. The world insisted on small questions. He didn't know why men asked great things when a fist of dust could answer in a heartbeat. She answered with a sentence that landed like a stone. "I came to marry you." Eli's first impulse was to laugh, a short, humorless sound that had nothing to do with finding the declaration amusing. The notion that the girl he'd dragged out of smoke would come back grown and bent toward him in marriage felt like an intrusion. He glanced at the cabin, at the open wall waving in the wind like a hand. He measured danger the way he measured wood, certain, practical, soluble. He wondered if this was madness or calculation on her part. "Marriage is a strong word," he said, because words have weight, and he was careful where he let them fall. She watched him, expression unyielding. "I remember the night you came," Apache said. "You let me sit by your fire. You said nothing about keeping me. You wrapped my hair back and you said my name when I wouldn't. I thought you were the sort who would go on walking. But I remember the man with the coat who kept the door closed. I remember what it felt like to have a place that wasn't only danger. It was a memory refracted through the present. Eli felt it like wind under his shirt, cold and very sharp. For a long beat, he stood with the smell of her, the hint of smoke still fallen into her hair, and the sudden unreal possibility that a life could begin again with someone else choosing him. There were too many reasons to say no. There were deeper reasons tearing his tongue away from agreeing. He had told himself he was not to be chosen. He had chosen solitude with the same fierce deliberation as a vow. She angled her head. "Do you remember me? Or did you only remember the saving?" He had remembered the saving. He had not expected this return. The truth of that landed without pretension. He had kept away because closeness demanded a ledger he wasn't prepared to open. But there was another truth, one that had nothing to do with what he could no longer afford. He had not forgotten the face of someone who had fit into his jacket and fallen asleep trusting the world to him. That had been a small, clean proof that he had been able to do something right. "Come inside," he said at last. It was not kindness as much as a tactician's choice. She needed water, shelter, food, and there was a private part of him that wanted to see the woman who now stood before him. She crossed the threshold with bare feet that had seen too many miles. Inside, the cabin smelled of cut pine and oil, of coffee grounds, and the ghost of smoke from an old camp. He found a tin basin and set it on the table. Water from the spring, cool enough to make the skin blanch, splashed like small silver coins when he poured. Apache sat with her hands folded in her lap. When he loosened the laces on her boots, he saw the marks on the underside of her wrists, pale grooves, healed badly, a knot of anger and fear that lasted in tissue. He did what he had done before, whatever it took to make the immediate threat less obvious. He rinsed grit from a wound the size of a coin on her forearm, dabbed at it until the sting bent her mouth in a little line, and wrapped the bandage with the patience of a man who'd seen enough to know that haste made other wounds. She watched him, her gaze steady but not passive. She asked no questions he could not answer. When she spoke, she did so carefully, choosing language the way a cook chooses salt. "You still have the knife with the bone handle," she observed. "You put it on the wall." He looked up at it, the old knife he'd sharpened with his thumb, the way a man sharpens old apologies. He had not thought to name anything to himself in years, had not collected more than what fit on his belt, but the knife was his. He had kept it because it had a balance that suited his hand. He found himself behind his own voice, saying things he had not intended to. "You said you'd come back," he said. She nodded. "I came back." There was a pause, like a held breath between them. Around them, the day slid, the light thinning. He set a cup of coffee by her hands. She wrapped both hands around it and drank slowly. She did not ask him to fill in the gaps of her absence. She gave him information in pieces, the bare threads of what had been, of a life that had slipped from safety into something rough and afraid. "My people broke," she said once, in the way one might say the weather. She did not say more, and sometimes less was entire. When the bandage was secure and her coat borrowed and warming, a silence settled that was not the absence of words, but the presence of two people learning how to be near. Eli watched the way her shoulders moved as she breathed. He watched because it was a compass. If she relaxed, he would know the world could be trusted. He had not allowed himself to expect such relief. The house felt close, like a chest closed around them both. The first night she slept in the lean-to. The sky went hard and crowded with stars. He lay awake and thought of the child. The night flames had licked the trees, and he had carried someone he could not recognize as his responsibility. He had closed his eyes on the scream and willed it into a small, manageable thing. Now, with her back a few feet away and the sound of her breath in the dark, the old guilt thinned and knotted in new patterns. A life interrupted had returned, and that unsettled the bones of his careful solitude. When dawn came, the world was made of the work that needed doing. She moved as if she belonged in such rhythms. She swept dust from the table, scoured the basin until it shone, and baked the sort of flat bread that asked for nothing but plain ingredients and a hot pan. Eli watched her lift a slab of dough and fold it as if it were a map, her hands sure, her motions practiced. There was no apology in her competence. He found himself giving her tasks without meaning to: tend the garden bed, mend the saddle, fetch kindling from the east ridge. She replied to each command with efficiency and a quiet that did not beg approval. Once, when he handed her a piece of leather and a needle to repair a strap, she took it, and for a moment he could not tell if she was learning or remembering. The stitches were measured, straight. She hummed under her breath, an old tune clipped into notes, and for the first time in a long while, Eli let himself think in small, domestic images. Supper at the table, 2 plates, a lamp set to one side. They built a rhythm quickly, not in leaps of sentiment, but in the accumulation of small, trustworthy things. She learned to stoke the stove so the flame didn't flare. He watched the way soot collected on the back of her hands and thought of all the ways a person could be stained. She taught him, or rather reminded him, of the gentler forms of speech. A look that said, "I'm here," a touch that said, "Don't go." They sat at the edge of the wash and watched the stream make a new route when the storms came. She listened when he spoke about the line between hunting and vengeance, and he listened when she spoke of nights as traps, how the sky could close on a person and the stars would not help. He taught her to shoot with a rifle that had belonged to a man who'd never come home, not because he wanted to make her less of a woman, but because he wanted her to stand where he could stand, shoulder to shoulder. "Keep your elbow tucked," he said for the 3rd time one afternoon, and she adjusted, jaw clenched, and then surprised him by laughing when the first shot went true. "You have a good eye," he told her. It was as close to praise as he gave, and she turned it over in her mouth like a coin. "I needed to learn," she said. "The world is not kind to those who cannot guard themselves." Her voice held neither bitterness nor plaintive resignation. It was a fact. Sometimes their work was a kind of worship, nailing boards in place to keep wind out, hemming curtains that would not flap in winter, raising a low fence so the horse could graze safely. Each action was a promise made in timber and sweat. When they stacked stones to make a small fireplace, they spoke little. Words in those moments felt superfluous. Touch and trust were the mortar. The days turned to weeks with a steady, patient motion. The cabin, his once solitary shelter, grew in the way a person grows into a shared shirt. Measured alterations, seams adjusted. Apache made a place at the table. She set her things on a peg and kept a small bundle of braided hair ties wrapped in cloth. There were evenings when they sat on the porch and watched the sun sink behind the mesa, and the world painted itself in colors that did not need names. On one such evening she reached for his hand to steady herself on a loose board, and their fingers met in a way that took both off guard. He did not withdraw. The touch was small and monumental at once. "You said you wanted me to choose you," she said one night, voice barely a thread. They had been repairing shutters together, and the light of the lamp cut their faces into planes. "I came here because you saved me once, but I didn't come to be saved again." Eli looked at her. "I know that," he said. He wanted to say more, plead, promise, explain how unworthy he felt of being asked, but his mouth stayed closed. Words could complicate, could twist an honest motion into something sticky. He let his silence be an answer. They both lived by daylight and by tasks, but there were other noises that came with the land, signs that others also thought the open country a place for their business. Tracks in the dry earth showed the passing of riders who did not belong to them. Horseprints set too close together, a trace of where a hoof slipped in sand and steadied itself. Once, late one afternoon, Apache came in from the ridge, with the alert of someone who had seen a hawk too close to a nest. The lines at the corner of her mouth sharpened. "Riders," she said, "not the kind who pass by." She did not elaborate. Eli felt the air shift the way it does before a storm, a charge that made the hair on his arms prick. He read the tracks the way you read a letter, a scrawl with punctuation and intention. The prints were too fresh. Someone had moved through the wash that morning. Smoke had pulled at the valley's edge last night. A column had caught his attention, just enough to make him look away. He had not wanted to see danger here. He had wanted to keep the place simple. That evening he kept watch past midnight. The sky was sharp as a knife. He sat on the porch with the rifle across his knees and watched the ridgeline for movement. The world under the stars was a different place. Darker, leaner, the sense of risk having a throat. Apache slept inside on the cot he had set up so she would not be exposed to the open night. He thought about what ruin meant as a name. Ruin as desolation, as a thing that came and took the names of people away. Names, he had learned, were good things to hold. When he went to check the horse one dusk, he found small tokens near the fence, marks that had not been left by wind or animal, but meant to claim territory. A scrap of cloth tied to a stake, a notch cut in a pole. They were childish signs and dangerous ones at once, the language of men who mark what they intend to return for. He showed Apache the marks, and she peered at them with a calm that anger could not touch. "They are trying to make it known we are seen," she said. "They want to frighten. They are loud until you see they are empty. Then they become quiet and dangerous." Eli listened to the way she spoke, the economy of her language. He had thought he would tell her to leave until the danger passed, or to send her away to some safer town where she could be beyond the reach of men who traded in people. But she had not come to him to be kept safe. She had come to make a choice, to stake a claim with him. The idea that he might send her away because he was afraid seemed suddenly cruel and small. He set his jaw and waited until night had a foot in the world and the moon had not yet decided to rise. He worked by lamplight, bolting shutters and sliding thick boards into place. He put new locks where the old ones had rusted and hid a cache of provisions beneath the floorboards. He taught Apache how to wedge the door and how to listen when the wind carried false sounds. She learned quickly, and he felt uncomfortably gratified by her aptitude. The watch became their joint work. He kept the rifle. She walked the fence and ran fingers along the nails with the kind of care that checked for looseness. They shared the weight of being seen. There were days when they both sat close to the hearth and spoke of ordinary things, how the winter might pinch the supply of flour, whether the horse would need to be shoed, but under every sentence lay the patient, quiet understanding of the other's vulnerability. "There is a man," she said one night, nearly as if she were naming a weather pattern, "who I think is the one who sent those signs. He calls himself Ruin." She did not say more than that. The way she said the name made the syllables fall like cinders. Eli felt something tighten behind his breastbone. Names were tools. You could aim them at people and bring them low. "Ruin your name?" he asked. She shrugged. "Names are what men take for themselves," she said. "They are not always true." He thought then of the men who had chased and bartered and sold, the men who had left ruins in their wake and called it business. He thought of the small hands his had held once, and how every choice he'd made since had been an attempt to keep from being caught by what haunted him. He realized with a clarity that surprised him that his life already had a ruin in it, the places he had walked away from, the people he had sworn to save and had not. "You won't go alone if they come," he said. She looked at him as one might examine the horizon, with a long, calm consideration. "I don't expect to," she replied. "You have shown me how to make a shelter. I did not come to be carried. I came to choose." They made a plan that felt less like strategy and more like a list of promises. They would reinforce the cabin. They would learn the routes men used and set false trails for them. They would handle the horse so it could get away on a short signal. Eli taught Atsai how to move quietly, how to fold her steps around the song of the creek so a boot wouldn't catch the sound of being human. Atsai taught him how to stitch leather neat and steady, to use the smallest thread to hold what would otherwise fray. At night they practiced in the dark. 2 silhouettes at the edge of the wash, a lantern making soft halos near their feet. The sound of a rifle breaking the air once and then twice went into Eli's bones the way the hammer used to. Each impact was a punctuation he could trust. She set the stock to her shoulder and steadied. He watched the tightening of her jaw and how her body answered the recoil without surprise. She was not a child anymore. There were other nights when they drank coffee and listened to the land live. A coyote called at a distance. A storm juggled the scent of sage. Once, in a fit of dry, necessary honesty, he told her about the men he had not been able to bring in time. He did not give names. He gave her the small, sharp details of the way a trap snapped closed and left its mark. "You did what you could," she said, and there was no pity in the sentence. It was an acknowledgment like a key fitting a lock. "You have hands that do good. That matters." He had nothing ready to say to that, except a grunt that could stand for gratitude, the admission that he had been chosen, not because he was heroic, but because he had once been the one to grip a child and lift her over the fire, was uncomfortable and oddly relieving. He had not thought to be chosen. He had meant to remain a man of few attachments. The days were a balance of work and silence, of watches and small victories, yet the marks of others crept closer. One morning, while he was out checking the perimeter, he saw a rider on the far ridge. For a heartbeat, the line between present and past snapped taut. The rider sat still, watching, and then galloped out of sight. Tracks told him there were more. Men who watched could be patient. They could wait to force an opening. That knowledge pressed on him like a heavy hand. He told her when he returned. "They're circling," he said. He kept his voice level, but there was a steel inside it. She looked at him, and the look said plainly, "Then we make it so circling doesn't win." She did not ask to be spared, only to be included in the plan. They spent the afternoon fortifying. Eli taught her how to wedge shutters with a single bar, so they wouldn't be easily forced. They dug a shallow trench around the cabin that would make it harder for a horse to come at speed without giving a warning. They hid a small cache of water and food in the hollow beneath the hearth, tucking the provisions under the smoothing stone like a secret. When they paused, hands raw and clothes dusted with sore resin and sweat, they both sat on the steps and shared a piece of bread. The sun slanted and the landscape settled, and for a moment the world was ordinary. She took his hand without ceremony and held it. He let it lie there, as if her fingers could steady more than the skin they crossed. The gesture was a stitch in a garment being made. "You will not be alone," he said simply. It was a promise that included more than protection. It included the small, necessary vow of choosing to remain. The word marriage hung between them like something that could be taken apart or built anew. He could not promise ceremonies or towns or legalities, but he could promise his company and his labor and his watch. Atsay smiled, a little brief thing, and when she spoke the words were as practical as a tool. "I do not need a paper to bind us," she said. "I need you to stand. I need a place to stay. I need you to say you will not leave." He answered by tightening his jaw and nodding. "You'll have my name when it matters," he said, and the sentence had no fanfare. It was an offer of the simplest kind. That night, a wind came down from the northwest in a way that suggested rain might come or might not. The mesa threw long shadows like reaching hands. Eli sat up to watch the horizon and saw the faint, single smoke plume rise beyond the next ridge. It was a small thing, inked against the moonlight, but it said there were men moving in the dark. He could feel the hair on his neck pick up like a horse sensing a storm. He woke Atsay carefully, mindful of the way she slept now. One shoulder loosened into the crust of his cot, and told her what he saw. She slipped into her boots soundlessly and brought the rifle to her shoulder as if it were a continuation of herself. They moved through the dark in a choreographed silence that had come from weeks of practice. They reached the hill where they could watch without being seen. The valley yawned below, a patchwork of silver stream and black brush. At the foot of the rise, men had made a camp, a low cluster of horses, a fire that had burned low but not out, the dull glint of metal where someone had left tools. A single figure moved near the fire, tall with a loose gait. The way he carried himself made Eli's temper flare like the old scars under his skin. Ruin. The name climbed in his throat with no ceremony. Atsay had said it once like a map, but seeing the man now, the slow chew of his jaw, the way he flicked at the coals as if he were unsettling embers of memory, made the name an animal with teeth. Eli's hand tightened around his rifle. He once more measured the place and the risks, thinking in the clear, narrow terms he trusted. If those men came for Atsay, they would come with greed in their eyes. If they came for the cabin, they would do it by force. If he had to move, the night offered the cover. But this was not the moment to be rash. He and Atsay watched until the man by the fire leaned back and glimpsed something across the wash. For a terrifying second, it felt as if the world froze, waiting for either predator or prey to make a choice. The man did not stand and call. He only blinked, like someone marking a breach in expectation, and then he turned and gestured. The figures rose from the dark, and the camp smelled suddenly and keenly of the danger that did not announce itself with fireworks, but with the soft shuffling of boots. They came down from the hill with the kind of silence that belonged to shadows. Eli's heart hammered with the old readiness, the slow feeling of his body remembering the motions, even when his head protested. He had vowed to keep the place quiet. Now he had to keep it alive. Atsay pressed her shoulder against his as they moved. The touch was a contract. He felt it like an ember pressed to tinder. She did not look away from the men below. The world had narrowed again to the space between them and the other men, whose intentions had already been given names he would not say out loud. He slid back into the shadows and let the night do the work of concealment. He could not yet see the end of what they had begun, only the necessity of action. The cabin behind them was a small, stubborn light. Inside, there were boards waiting to be hammered, food stacked like quiet promises, and, no small thing, the possibility that someone had chosen to build a life beside his. He thought of the child he had carried from the burning pines, and of the woman who had come back across country with worn boots and a clear purpose. He thought of vows not spoken. He thought of the night as a thing that could take names and return them fresh. At the edge of the wash, the men from the camp moved with an impatient rhythm. The tallest of them, broad-shouldered, face shadowed by a hat, stopped and looked up toward the cabin. For a long breath, the three of them, Eli, Apache, and the tall man, held their small, separate truths. The wind did not give an answer. Eli's finger curled around the trigger of his rifle, not pressing, but holding the possibility of force, like a weathered tool. He had not wanted this life of constant watch, but he had taken it when the world demanded it. He had not expected a woman who had once fit inside his coat to come back and ask for more than shelter. He had not expected to feel, against all his careful plans, that staying might mean finally allowing someone else to choose him. Apache's breath steamed faint in the night air. In the hollows beneath her eyes, the years of being taken and given and taken again had left a map that could be read by anyone who knew how to look. But her stance was not of a person waiting to be carried. It was of a person prepared to stand. "We're together," Eli said, in a voice that surprised him by its tenderness. It was the simplest answer he could give. It was not a promise of ceremonies or paper, but it was a vow of presence that had weight. She nodded once, her hair braided and caught the moon like a line. "We are," she agreed. The man in the camp set his jaw, gave a small signal, and 6 horses moved like a pattern unfolding. The hillside shifted. The game had begun. Eli took a breath and let the dark do its work. He had always known that there would be a price for stepping into the fray. He had always known there were men whose names made the air taste sour. He had not known, though, that the price might include the messy, beautiful work of learning to live with someone who had decided, to the point of making the long trip across the country, that he was her chosen place. They melted into plan and movement, the night cloaking them, and the valley held its breath. If you love cinematic Western dramas, hit subscribe and stay for more stories like this. They moved like two parts of a single machine through the night. Eli taking the low shadows, Apache a silent mirror at his back. The ridge tasted of cold stone and the river's metallic edge. Down below, the camp was a pale pit of embers, horses tied in sleepy knots, the men breathing smoke that rose and broke against the sky. Ruin's silhouette by the coals looked larger than his frame, a man made of bad decisions and practiced cruelty. His presence unmade the valley in a slow, careful way. Eli watched the stretch of men, as if reading a letter written in hoof and boot and tobacco spit. The way they kept their heads low, the quick cadence of their movements, these were the things he had tracked in 12 other places, and read as clearly as any notice nailed to a post. He found the shape of the night, and placed himself so that their light would never flatten him. His hand rested on the rifle more habit than thought. Apache's breathing was a soft cadence against his shoulder. He felt the press of her against him, and remembered the child who had once slept under his coat, the smoke in her hair, and the smallness of weight that had made an ache in him loosen. The woman beside him was not small now. She was a sure-edged thing who carried the same memory tempered into a purpose. He could hear the small click as she checked the chamber of her rifle, the practiced hush that comes from someone who has learned to make their body an answer. They waited. A horse shifted in the camp below. A man cursed softly when it snorted. Ruin spoke in that low voice of his to a figure near him. Eli could not catch the words, but the cadence said command. The men tightened. They would approach with calculation, not rush, because the kind of men who trafficked in people had learned patience as a weapon. Eli's plan was direct. He had never been a man for clever traps. He preferred things that admitted a straight line. Intercept, disable, move the threat. They had dug a shallow trench and hidden a cache beneath the hearth. They had wedged shutters and stashed knives and water. They had also learned the lay of the land, false beats in tracks, places where a rider must lose pace, where a shout would catch on the wind and scatter the thought of surprise. He pointed once, a small tilt of the chin, and they moved. The hillside swallowed them. Each footfall was measured, each breath metered. In the wash nearest the cabin, Eli left a false trail of broken stems and diverted dust. a small, deliberate mess to suggest passage. Atsai walked a hair behind him, then slid up to a flank when they reached the last scrub before the camp. He wanted to be the one to meet Ruin. He had obligations to debts the world didn't forgive. But he did not intend to go alone. In the faint grey before dawn, the men broke their camp with the ease of those who think the country owes them nothing and takes everything. They moved toward the cabin with a slow confidence, the kind that comes from men used to having the last word. One rode ahead, scoping for sightlines without knowing the thinness of his advantage. Eli watched and waited for the moment the man stepped into the crate of their plan. When the lead rider spurred his mount through the wash and toward the cabin, Eli rose like a ghost. The man had been taught to expect suddenness on the trail, but not the kind of silence that came with a rifle's end. Eli's shot cracked the night open. The man's horse shied hard, and its rider tumbled in a spray of dust. It was not an aim at the man so much as a severing of a possibility. Horses, left without riders, made decision. The others hesitated, and hesitation is a thing that eats confidence. Ruin cursed and barked an order. The camp turned like a small animal that had felt a blow. Eli heard the clatter of boots and a dozen voices gathering themselves into a form. He slid behind the nearest sagebrush and signaled Atsai. She stepped forward like a shadow uncoiling and fired without ceremony at a wheel of an offset wagon. The bullet cheeked just enough to slow their approach. A horse threw its head, a man beside it staggered, and the rhythm of the attackers fractured. They had meant to scare, to mark territory. Eli and Atsai made it clear mark and fear were not the same. The attackers had to decide if they would gamble on brute force or vanish and return with more measured cruelty. Ruin, who liked names and the smell of acclaim, did not choose vanishing. He chose menace. The first real move was a run up the slope, men like dark notes thrown forward. Eli met them with his rifle low, then a column of motion, an impact that was muscle and bone, and a memory of nights he had spent where men came to harm, and someone had to stop it. He had been a tracker once, and his body remembered what his conscience refused to carry. There was a flash of leather and metal, a man falling, the sound of a body meeting dirt, and the old, awful hush that follows violence. Ruin came like a bad weather, sudden, inevitable, angry. He stepped from the group with the predatory confidence Eli had come to hate. He was not a big man by rulings of frame, but he was a man who had taught himself to take up room. Eli let him come. Up close, the two men were a study in temperaments, one bland with habitual violence and the other tight with a coiled care. Their first exchange was not words, but measures. A shove, a waste of breath, the soft sound of fists testing. Ruin moved to throw a fist, and Eli's shoulder absorbed it with the memory of 100 practiced counters. The fighting was animal and immediate, a tangle of boots and hands, a scramble that left no room for theatrics. Eli struck when he needed to, and held when he didn't. He used weight and leverage, and the kind of cold patience that has nothing to do with bravado. Ruin tasted iron and grit and surprise. He had not anticipated a man who had been both hunter and builder, the kind of man who would not simply use a gun, but would be comfortable in the dirt. They hit the scrub and rolled, a short, brutal dance. Atsai, who had never been a bystander by temperament, moved in when opportunity allowed. She did not lay hands on Ruin with a vengeance. She pinned his arm and held with the quiet force of someone who knew how to keep a thing in place. Her rifle lay close by, not used for grand gestures, but as a practical tool. For a moment they were a knot of motion, with Eli's hands in Ruin's collar and Atsai pressing a knee into his ribs. Ruin's anger boiled and then curdled into a cold resignation. "Not worth dying for," Eli said, not really a question. He had no illusions of law in that spot. He had only a sense that cruelty should not be allowed to keep its stride. Ruin spat and tried to twist, but the man's bravado could not outmuscle joint decisions and the small arithmetic of two people who had been practicing survival together. They bound Ruin with a rope pulled off an overturned saddle and lashed him within sight of the men who had come with him. The others, faced with the suddenness of their leader's capture and the loss of surprise, fell into indecision. A few pressed forward, snarling and making noise. Others hung back, their courage dissolving when met with the reality of a man they had expected to dominate, now taken down by hands they had underestimated. The leaderless tendrils of their intention unspooled. Eli's voice was flat as desert stone when he addressed them. "Ruin is taken. Go back to where your coin keeps you warm and don't come near this place." It was not a speech so much as a precise offering. Leave with your pride and your life intact, or return and lose both. A crust of sanity clung to most men. They chose their skin. A handful spat curses and rode off in the cool, dry path of retreat. In the clarity of the morning, their horses looked like ordinary animals made anxious, not instruments of a terror they intended to inflict. Ruin, bound and furious, cursed until his voice ran out. There was a small fortune of ugly words in him, and Eli let most of them fall away like dry leaves. There was no satisfaction in hearing him promise what he could not now act upon. There was only an efficiency of stopping what could stop here and now. Atzai leaned close to Ruin in the dirt, her voice low and spare. She did not need to say the things that would lure him into fear. She only needed to announce that the line had been crossed. Her presence at Eli's side, when it mattered, was a language in itself. Eli felt a kind of permission bloom in him, permission to allow something gentle and true to take a foothold. They made the decision to send Ruin into town, to the marshal, because there were things a frontier could not rightly settle on its own without becoming as ugly as the men it fought. Eli hitched a spare bridle to the captured man, tied him to the second horse, with careful knots that would not maim but would keep. He left one of the men who had come with Ruin, one who had shown the common sense to step back, in the custody of his indignity, while he rode the long, quiet hours into the nearest outpost. Atzai stood watching the men leave, the dust swirling in the early sun. She did not cheer or jeer, but folded her hands like a small, disciplined prayer. They walked back to the cabin, in a silence that was not empty, but full of the aftertaste of violence and the sober work of mending. Inside, the cabin seemed to exhale. The boards they had hammered into place the week before stood like a small fortress. The hearth, blackened and rebuilt, held the memory of their night's labor. Eli unbound his own hands and sat on the workbench like a man who had aged a decade in the span of an hour. Atzai moved about with the caring motions that had become their shared liturgy. She boiled water, tended to a scraped shin he had received in the fray, and smoothed a hand over the grain of the table as if calming some sleeping thing. "How bad?" she asked, her voice small in the dust-pale light. "Not worse than it might have been," he said. It was an answer that held both gratitude and weary accounting. He had expected grief to surge, to demand offerings, but it came instead as a slow, practical inspection of needs. A bandage, a place to rest, a promise that the night would not always be like that. They bound the man's cuts with the same careful hands that had bound hers before, Atzai's fingers deft with twine and cloth, Eli's jaw tight as he tended to the knuckle that had taken a beating. In the doing, there was a language neither had to translate. Repair is a kind of mercy. They ate bread and dried jerky and drank coffee black as truth, and with every small mouthful, the world reassembled itself into practicable bits. When Eli returned from taking Ruin to the marshal in the next town, a dusty, lean trip, accompanied by the slow understanding that law could be slow but was a better option than frontier vengeance, he found the cabin waiting in a way that made him unaccountably soft. Atzai had stacked wood in a neat line by the door. There was a small woven rug at the threshold, his boots wiped clean next to it. Her hands, as they always did, had turned the place into something that accepted bodies rather than merely sheltering them. She met him on the steps with no fanfare, only the same directness that had made her return possible. "What did he say?" she asked. "He'll be kept for now," Eli said. "Marshall's got a horse and a ledger. The law will decide what to do with him." She nodded. There was relief in the nod, not triumph. "That is enough," she said. She looked at him then, really looked, like someone appraising a thing she had chosen. "You did not let him take me back." Eli could have deflected the credit. He had been taught to do that. But there was a truth that had weight in the world. He had stood to be present, and in that present, things had changed. "You didn't come to be carried," he said. "You came to choose." She smiled, and in the smile there was an admission of joint work, of mutual crisis averted, and a future now possible. For a moment they simply stood in the light together, two people who had made a choice and borne the consequences. Life resumed its cadence, not a return to the old solitude, but a new rhythm that accepted two sets of chores and two flavors of humor. They finished the fourth wall of the cabin over the course of weeks, nailing plank to plank until the lean-to stood as a proper shelter. They patched a hole in the roof and set glass into a window frame that caught the sun at certain hours and painted the table with honey-colored light. Apache brought a small bundle of seeds she had kept, corn and beans that would be sure to grow if the soil obliges. And Eli turned a small plot into a garden with a stubborn willingness. There were soft rituals that framed their days. In the mornings they would fetch water together. At noon they would eat what the earth offered them. In the evenings they would sit by the hearth and spin small stories about the day. Neither tried to fill the silences with explanations. Their language became gestures and glances, an agreement stitched quietly into the fabric of the place. Intimacy, when it came, arrived with a slow and patient consent. They did not hurry to make vows in the way towns did with their churches and rings and witnesses. Marriage, for them, had to be an act of mutual recognition rather than a certificate alone. There were evenings when they sat on the porch and asked each other small questions about childhood shadows, about what made them laugh, about the names of stars they had seen from other roofs. They learned the small things, the private cartography of a person. One night, long after the assault but with the memory of its heat still smoking in the back of their minds, Apache drew him into the cabin as rain tapped in a staccato against the roof. She closed the shutters and lit a single lantern. The light pooled around them like an island. "You saved me once," she said, voice even, the sentence both memory and marker. "You could have left when the world looked too much like it used to. You didn't." He could have deflected it, but he had grown tired of renting out his truth for the convenience of solitude. "I have kept to myself because I thought it was safer," he admitted. "I thought not to be chosen was the way to not be hurt." She reached for his hand, fingers warm and sure. She did not make the sort of dramatic declarations he'd read about in other men's tales. Her words were simple, pared down to essentials. "I remember the night you wrapped me in your coat," she said. "You said my name when no one else would. I came back because I chose this place and because I chose you. I'm not asking to be kept. I'm asking to be your wife." There was a quiet in him then, like the hush of the land before a storm, raw, expectant. The word wife carried with it history and obligations, but in her mouth it was less a claim of possession and more a shared map, a plan for how two people would move forward together. Eli had always been hesitant to use labels. He had been a man who kept ledger and ration, the number of people he allowed himself to care for, the weight of attachments he could carry. But standing there, with his tools at his feet and the taste of smoke in the air, he understood that marriage needed little ceremony beyond the act of mutual choosing. He reached into a pocket and drew out a small circle of wood he had carved in the winter, smoothed in the shape of a promise, worn at the edges from time. It was foolish, perhaps, to offer a carved ring when the world measured worth differently. But it was the best he had, something made by his hand, honest and simple. "I can't promise paper or a preacher," he said, "but I can promise this. You will have my name when it matters, and you will have my back when it hurts." Atsai looked at the wooden band, and then at him, and something small and fierce folded into her expression. She rose and took the ring between her fingers, testing its weight. "Then we will be married by what we keep," she said. "We will bind ourselves by what we choose to do for each other." They exchanged no legal vows and no flourish of town attendees. They sat side by side, with the lantern making their breath bright, and whispered words that mattered. Promises to wake each other, to tend wounds, to leave when each other's safety demanded, and to return when it decided to let them. There was a simple formality in the way they tied a strip of leather around each other's wrists and then knotted it twice, a small binding that would come loose when needed, but not so easily no one could deny its intention. Consent hummed in the air before anything further happened, not as a script but as a mutual settling. They kissed then, not like lovers in a fever, but like two people who'd earned the right to a soft, steady touch. The kiss was respectful, true to the history of both. It stayed with them like a shared secret. Afterwards, they lay with their hands clasped, the wooden ring between their joined fingers, listening to rain stitch the roof together. Word of ruin's capture and delivery spread in small circles. It moved like a candle passed in a long room. The marshal's ledger recorded the event, and the sight of a man once feared sitting in the lockup like any other human thing. It was no triumphal parade, but it was justice given the limits of a wild country. Eli returned with the knowledge that law had been served and that he could set his shoulders to more ordinary work without the immediate shadow of the man who had sought to own others. Seasons shifted in the way only the land knows. The harsh, bright heat gave way to a crispness that left mornings sharp. They planted winter crops and lent their hands to the fence and to the building of a small lean-to that became a proper room. Eli nailed a small plank at the door's threshold, and Atsai painted a simple line across it. No inscription, only the mark of a shared hand. Neighbors came and went, offering the kind of gossip that becomes the fabric of a remote community. Some were cautious, some were curious. Most of them, once they saw how they kept their place and how they traded the work of their days, treated them as they deserved. Neighbors, not novelties. There were visits that tested the ease they had made. A man in town who remembered Eli's past and tried to drag old debts into new light. A traveler who asked questions about Atsai's origins with a curiosity that edged toward proprietorship. Each time they navigated with the currency of their pact, a conversation, a steady gaze, a shared readiness to call on the law or the weight of community. They found their voices together, and the world, small as it might be, learned to accept the presence they insisted upon. Once, on a summer evening when the stars were like scattered seeds, they walked to the wash and stood side by side. Atsai plucked a small sprig of sage and handed it to him. He took it as if it were a relic, an ordinary thing made sacred by their use. He placed it on the sill of the window they had fixed together. "I remember when you carried me," she said, looking out at the black ridge. "I'm not asking you to carry me now. I'm asking you to look at me and stay." He drew her close, not to protect, but to be held in equal measure. "I remember the night you fit into my coat," he said, "and I remember the sound of your breathing when you slept. I won't pretend I know how to be anything but honest with what I have to give." They married. It was not with a priest in a whitewashed church or with a parade through town. It was in the cabin with a handful of neighbors as witnesses, people who had seen the way they had kept their place and respected the choice they'd made. A neighbor, a wiry woman named May with a face like knotted cloth, read a few lines of scripture she liked for their practicalness, about being companions in weather and work. Another neighbor, a quiet man who'd once lost everything and learned candor as a currency, spoke of vows as acts rather than words. Eli and Atsai exchanged their promises simply. He offered his carved band. She tied her braid with a leather thong and set it into his palm. There was no ritual from a culture not theirs, no claim to customs they hadn't agreed upon, only the honest, plain exchange of two people accepting one another's names and labors. They clasped hands and said aloud, "We choose." The phrase was small and carried every weight they intended. Afterwards they ate, meager, but eaten with laughter that loosened sinew. The neighbors left with a nod and the small satisfaction of having seen a thing done right. When they were alone again, the cabin felt larger, not because it had been widened, but because the quiet shared inside it had multiplied. Years, as they will, kept moving. The garden came in with generous yield. Children of saplings grew into a shade they had not yet asked for, and the cabin's door saw many comings and goings. But through it all, the simple truth held. Apache had chosen to return to the place where a boy had once been carried in a man's coat, and Eli had chosen to remain. Their marriage was not a cure for past traumas nor a bandage for all losses. It was, however, a place of shelter for two people who decided day by day to show up for one another. One afternoon, as the sun leaned toward evening and threw their shadows long across the wash, Apache sat on the porch and braided his hair with the kind of slow, sure movements that had cemented 1,000 small acts into a whole. Eli worked on a wooden plough rest, shaving a notch clean and careful with the same patience he had always used on his nails. They did not speak loudly. They had learned the ways of contentment do not require volume. "You remember the fire?" she asked suddenly, the image like an ember passed along conversation. He paused and smiled, an odd habit that had come into his face since she had been standing in it. "Small enough to carry," he said, thinking of the smaller, earlier man who had thought a single rescue an answer to 1,000 debts. She looked up at him. "You remember my name?" "I remember your name," he said, and in saying it he opened a thing that would not close easily, the acceptance that what he had done once contained no question marks about what he would do again. He had been chosen, he had chosen back. The house still had its scars and its rough joints, but they made it into something whole. A child, rosy-faced and inquisitive, born from neighbors passing their congratulations, ran by and tripped, and both Eli and Apache lunged without thinking. The child laughed. The sound knitted their solitude into a kind of communal cloth. In the quiet that followed, they sat and watched dusk gather. The mesa swallowed the last rim of sun, and the sky turned a slow blue. On the table lay the wooden band, worn to a sheen from fingers and time. It was a small, honest relic of a vow. No one would make songs of it beyond nearby porches, but to them it was enough. Apache leaned her head against him and murmured, "Do you remember me, Cowboy?" He smiled, the line there on his face like a map he'd earned. "I do," he said, "and I remember why you came back." She kissed him, light as a closing of a book, an act of permission and acknowledgement. "I'm the Apache girl you saved," she said softly, words that had opened their story. "I'm back to marry you." "And I'm here," he answered, a promise as simple and immovable as the ridge. "We're together." They let the night come then, not as an enemy, but as the cover under which they had made a life. The cabin's hearth threw a small, steady light into the darkness, and the world beyond it held its old dangers and new mercies. Inside, two people who had learned the cost of watching and choosing sat with their hands folded, each a witness to the other's keeping. They had come through the heat and the dust and the cruel calculations of men who counted other human beings as currency, and they had decided, deliberately, with the lived weight of choice, to stay. If you want more stories like this, watch the next episode in the playlist.